Hi, everyone. I'm Heidi Hess, one of the co-directors of Credo Action, and I'm so happy to be here today to introduce Chris Hayashi and Isa Noyola from the Transgender Law Center, who are going to talk to us about their work. I'm feeling especially excited because this feels really personal to me. I was thinking today about what I'm curious to learn about the work that TLC does and why I'm so glad that we funded them in June. And I think it's because I realized that for myself, I was raised as a woman in a patriarchal, misogynistic society. And there were ways that I made myself fit and made myself small and made myself go along with things that were the way that the world is supposed to work for women based on the systems of oppression that exist in our world. And I think for me, I sort of lived with that for most of my life. I did things to try to change it, and I did things to try to make space for myself, but in some ways I sort of fundamentally lived with the fact that we were in a world that wasn't quite fair, where people didn't get to be their whole selves. And I know for myself that when I became a parent, that no longer became something that I was willing to live with. That for me, my kids being able to be their whole selves in the world became one of the most important things in my life. And I think that the work that TLC is doing is to say, unapologetically and 100%, we all get to be our whole selves all the time. And so they are fighting that fight for and with the transgender and gender nonconforming community across so many different areas of work. They are defending people's rights in the courts. They are passing bills that support people's rights and fighting against bad bills that are trying to take away their rights. They're giving transgender folks resources to advocate for themselves, whether it's in housing discrimination, in their workplace, at their schools, whether they're getting swept up in an ICE raid or trying to apply for asylum or being in prison, or whether they're, and I say simply because it's not simple at all, whether they're trying to get their identification documents in line with their gender identity. And so one of the things that when I was reading, looking at their website last night, I think this is the thing to me that feels so important. Their mission statement is that they are changing law and policy and attitudes so that all people can live safely, authentically, and free from discrimination, regardless of their gender identity or expression. And so we know that we're at a time when the fight is especially fierce for all of our rights, especially for transgender and gender nonconforming folks. And so I'm so glad that they're with us today to talk more about what they're doing. So thank you for being here.
Hi.
Hi, so thank you so much for having us here today. My name's Chris Hayashi. I'm the Executive Director at the Transgender Law Center. We are the largest national trans-led organization in the country advocating for self-determination for all people.
I'm Isa Noyola. I'm the Deputy Director at the Transgender Law Center, and it's an honor to be here to share a little bit about the work. We'll try to do it in not so convoluted ways in a little bit time that we have.
Absolutely. So we wanted to start out by just telling you a little bit about our community. So folks have probably seen things like this before. So, for many of us, we know from a very young age that we are a girl or a boy, right? And then there are some of us who actually don't fit into either of those boxes. And then for some of us, we know from a very young age that actually the gender that we know ourselves to be is not what our parents, what our families, what society is saying we are. So just a little bit about myself. So I grew up in Seattle, Washington. And so I was born a girl, but I knew from a very, very young age that I was a boy. And I was really fortunate in that my parents were very understanding about that. They were okay with having a tomboy for a kid. However, that really changed once I went to school. Students, teachers, school administrators, there was just a lot of intolerance and harassment that I faced as a young person. Fast forward to my early 20s, and that was when I actually first heard about transgender people. So this is going to date me a little bit, but this was before Google. It was before I could just type transgender in and find out so much about our communities. So a lot of what I knew about what it meant to be transgender was from word of mouth, was from people in community. And it was at that time that I started to transition. I started to try and access trans-related health care and faced, as so many of our community continues to face, so many barriers in accessing the health care that I needed. I was turned away from health care, denied health care multiple times, and this continues to be the reality for many of our community. And because I understood from a very, very young age that the world was really not set up for me to survive, that has really grounded me in my commitment to continue fighting for my communities, to continue to fighting for justice and for liberation.
So I'm a lucky girl. I'm one of the few unicorns that was raised here in the Bay Area. And I'm very proud of my Mexican heritage. My family came to this country undocumented in the 70s, and they moved here to the Bay. And, I am so thankful for that because the Bay, just culturally and just with the politically, there's just so many amazing moments here in LGBT history. And just all of that sort of informed the ways that I now identify as a trans Latina Mexican woman who is really understanding my identity in a holistic way. It's not just one piece, it's like how it's connected in all who I am. And so I think for me the rich cultural heritage that the Bay Area has is, and just in terms of the resistance, the activism, and just the various cultures. I mean, we were just so blessed to have that here in the Bay Area. And I think for me, the piece where I grew up in particular, like where I came up in my activism and in my work, was rooted in the Mission neighborhood of San Francisco, where I had the fortune to really get raised by a community of trans Latina mujeres, immigrant, undocumented community at Ela para Trans Latinas. Where I understood from an early age, in my transition, that to identify as a trans Latina is one of, in Spanish we say esfuerzo, of like just tenacity and of fight. And so we at the office have this altar of all the trans women that we've lost to the violence, and to all the ways in which transphobia has manifested in these very extreme ways of murder and death. And so we honor the women every single day, and it is a reminder to us the commitment that we have in this work. It is a commitment that we fight every single day, not just when things are bad.
So unfortunately for our communities, the violence that Isa was speaking of continues. So, we have been in this period over the last 4 or 5 years of really unprecedented visibility for the transgender community, with Laverne Cox on the cover of Time magazine, Janet Mock on the bestseller. Seller list. It was really a level of visibility that we have not experienced as a community. However, unfortunately, the deaths, the violence, the harassment against our communities continue. Every year for the last few years has been the most reported murders of transgender people in this country. And the same was true for 2017. And the reality is that the majority of those murders are of Black and brown transgender women.
So, oftentimes in the media and in our culture, there's this way that I think trans narratives are shared as it being these one-off sort of isolated incidents of violence and murder in these extreme sensationalized ways. And, our experience of doing this work for many, many years in the movement and at TLC has been that it's not just isolated, it's not just anecdotal, and that there's actually a whole way in which this comes together, both the individual, the interpersonal. Yes, there's like domestic violence issues, there's interpersonal issues, but there's also the ways in which in the everyday sort of the discrimination, the harassment that is happening, in public transportation or in accessing services, all those things coupled with the systemic pieces, the anti-trans attacks, the ways in which we're discriminated, in accessing public services or public accommodations, and the ways in which we're denied services, housing services, or the barriers to education, that all those things come together to form a perfect storm in terms of the conditions in which our community has been surviving for so long.
And while our communities have continued to face violence at all these different levels, the other reality for our community is that the majority of people, particularly transgender people of color, are really struggling to survive on a daily basis. So transgender people face 4 times the poverty rate of the general population. We continue to experience incredible discrimination in employment, which results in us facing 2 times the unemployment rate of the general population. And for Black transgender people, it's 4 times the unemployment rate. Transgender young people continue to face intense harassment, violence, and discrimination in schools, which means that 80% of transgender students in grades K through 12 report experiencing harassment. And some to the point where it's so severe that 1 in 6 are actually pushed out of school and unable to graduate. And we continue, as I experienced throughout my life, to face discrimination and barriers to accessing healthcare. And what that means is many of our community face really challenging health conditions. And one example of that is that the lifetime risk for HIV for a Black transgender woman is 1 in 2.
So, the experiences of trans folks in terms of the survival mode that we've been in, it's not new. For a lot of us in this moment, we feel like there's something familiar about these attacks, and there's something that we've been facing, and there's actually some wisdom in that as well, right? The ways in which we've survived so much attacks, so much isolation, so much marginalization as a community. And I think in this moment, it is helpful for us to ground ourselves that this is not new, that the attacks are not new, that the hate, the rhetoric, the political dialogue, it is not new in terms of for our community, for trans communities. And so, I think that this is a moment for us to ground ourselves in the legacies of resistance and the legacies of our community and the leadership of trans folks in this fight. And that has been sort of the larger vision of our work, and that what keeps us grounded in this moment. And, I think to Marsha P. Johnson, I think to Sylvia Rivera, of how they were faced with so much obstacles, so much violence, and in the face of that hate, in the face of that violence, that they had the tenacity, they had the coraje in Spanish, I'm sorry, I'm bilingual, that they had the coraje to really to fight and to really resist and to stand up and to mobilize and to organize a community. And so we stand on, we're not, our work does not stand alone. We're on the backs of our ancestors. And we have continued to see that across the country as we travel, as we are engaging communities across in many states like Arizona, Florida, New Mexico, in the rural South, that we are seeing this legacy manifest itself with our leadership of trans folks across this country, the ways that they're supporting each other, the safety strategies, the cutting edge work, the innovative work that they're doing with so very little, with very little support, very little resources, and we're seeing sort of magic happen in these communities as well.
So then Trump got elected. And we knew that in that moment, that more so than ever before, we needed to ground ourselves in that history of resilience, in the ways in which our communities all across the country have continued to resist. So we were really clear that this was a moment where we needed to do everything we could to harness community power, to do what it takes to keep trans and gender nonconforming people alive, thriving, and fighting for liberation in this moment. Because we were really clear about the ways that under this new administration, transgender people would be particularly vulnerable, would be particularly under attack. And we knew this because we had just come out of a period where we faced an onslaught of anti-trans legislation all across the country. So these so-called bathroom bills, which were really about criminalizing transgender people for simply trying to use the restroom, which was really about criminalizing us for simply trying to go about our lives. So we knew that this was a moment where we needed to really ground in the resistance and resilience of our community. And we also knew that transgender people, transgender leaders who are the front lines of fighting back against these attacks would have to fight to even have a seat at the table in these campaigns. So we knew that we needed to do everything that we could to make sure that transgender leaders who were at the forefront of these campaigns to have the resources, the information, the support, the training that they needed to continue to fight back. So we launched these national training institutes across the country where we train trans leaders, particularly in states that were facing anti-trans attacks, and provided them with those skills and resources to really build up a cadre and cohort of trans leaders all across the country. And one example is that in Anchorage, Alaska, just a couple months ago, they were facing an anti-trans ballot initiative. And the trans leaders in those states, with allies and with communities, were able to come together and actually defeat that ballot initiative, which was just incredible community power for our folks. We also have seen the ways in which transgender young people, even in this moment where a lot of the attacks coming down from this new administration are actually targeting transgender students, are continuing to speak out, continuing to be visible, continue to fight for their rights. And one way in which we keep fighting is in the courts. So one story is the story of Ash Whitaker. Ash is a transgender boy who lives in Wisconsin. And he was just trying to go to school and get an education like every other boy in his school. However, the school administration was forcing him to use a bathroom separate from all the other boys, and they even took it to the level of, they at one point thought about asking all the transgender students to wear some type of green marker so they could better monitor and surveil their bathroom.
That's not why I'm wearing green nails, by the way.
So we took the school district to court, and we won in the Seventh Circuit. So it is now clear that transgender students are protected from discrimination under Title IX and under the U.S. Constitution. We also know that this is a moment in which we also need to continue to build on the resilience and power of our communities. So we also know this is a moment where we really need to center those among us who are most targeted, who are most vulnerable and most facing attack. So one example of that is that we recently launched a project at the Transgender Law Center called Black Trans Circles, which is really about centering the leadership of Black trans women who are particularly experiencing violence, particularly vulnerable to a lot of the attacks, raising up their leadership, providing them wellness support, and really centering their voices in the ongoing fights we have against the attacks.
So like I said, so this moment is calling for us to ground ourselves in the wisdom, the lived wisdom of our communities, and it's also asking us to get clear around who's up front and who is leading this work and what voices are missing. And so there's no greater example of within the immigrant rights fight and ongoing movement work that's happening. And so for us at TLC, we realized that there were missing voices of Black LGBT migrants. And we have connections to communities with our network of folks that we are working with in coalition. And so we were really in this moment wanting to support that leadership, wanting to support through resources, wanting to support through creating spaces so that this leadership is really front and center and has a voice, not just in public-facing spaces, but also within the strategy, also within the resources, also within the work in general of organizing. And so we have, we're supporting a project called the Black LGBT Migrant Project, led by Ola, who is convening folks across the country to dig in, to build capacity, and to move this work. We are also facing the realization that this administration is relentlessly attacking the migrant community. And another clear example of that is how the hate speech that is coming from this administration around vulnerable populations, such as folks fleeing violence and persecution and are seeking safety and refuge and are trying to apply for asylum. And so we supported a caravan of Central American trans women fleeing from violence, who are survivors of trafficking, who are survivors of domestic violence, political persecution, and only to be met with more violence and more discrimination at the border. And so we quickly assembled a legal team from across the country to support this group, to support their process, and to support them presenting themselves at the border and their ongoing efforts to seeking asylum in this country. Because we also know that this administration is waging a war even with our most vulnerable populations. So it has been an amazing sort of intervention that we saw the resilience of the community and the wisdom of these women against all odds, against so many obstacles, still having the courage to hope and to have the desire to live their full life in this country. Unfortunately, with this administration, we are facing the loss, and we are facing the loss in very drastic ways, such as the case of Roxana, who is an Hondureña, who was a part of not the caravan that you saw, but a more recent one, and who died in ICE custody in New Mexico. And so we have been mobilizing community. We have been building people power to seek justice for Roxana, to seek justice that this never happens again, that in private detention facilities or ICE-run facilities, that the human rights violations that are occurring end for everyone. And in particular, this case highlights the way that ICE detention facilities are ripping away our humanity for all of us. So we are, this weekend, we are assembling, we are convening, we are gathering all of our queer and trans LGBT immigrant rights leaders, undocumented folks who, again, are just so amazing in this moment of showing up and showing out. And so we are convening folks this weekend in New Mexico to denounce this administration, to denounce the discrimination, to denounce the violence. And we are bringing together 100 folks to strategize, to network, to build support, to raise the visibility, and to really talk about safety strategies that they're needing in this moment to do this work, because we know that this work can get heavy at times, especially now. And so we are so excited to host, and we're so excited to bring together this amazing delegation of folks, and we're even bringing in folks from Honduras to also have a cross dialogue around what does it mean to do transnational organizing in this moment, and not just think about immigration within our context here in the U.S.
So we are really clear that in this moment, our community's resilience is resistance. And Credo has been a part of that. We cannot express enough what it meant for the Credo community to come together in June to support the Transgender Law Center and to support the transgender movement. In this moment where the current administration is doing everything it possibly can to deny our very humanity, to, in reality, actually try to deny our very existence. Like, we cannot say enough what it meant for the Credo community to support us, to support the transgender movement, that it really speaks to your leadership. It really speaks to the values and principles you hold and the ways in which you stand so visibly for justice and equality and liberation for all our communities. So we just want to really thank you for all your support and for having us here today.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for being here. I get to ask a few questions and then we'll turn it over to them. So sort of building on what you were just saying, I think people want to know how they can be in support of the struggles that the transgender community is facing right now. And some of those people are here in San Francisco, some of those people are in big cities. Some of those people are in small places where, maybe they don't even know what the policies of their school board or schools are and whether they're helpful or not helpful. So just curious what your thoughts are on sort of what folks can do or even sort of how folks can get informed at the local level about what's going on and how they can be allies.
Yeah, so there's definitely so many different ways to get involved. So, I mean, Transgender Law Center is one way. Definitely folks should check out our website. We have a legal resistance network and a community resistance network that we actually launched pretty soon after Trump came into the office, which is really a way for people all across the country, and you don't have to be a lawyer, to volunteer to help answer the types of like legal information needs that many folks in our community have. We also are definitely always needing more resources and support. So, you know, feel free to donate to us. And then the other thing that I will say is that there are just transgender organizations all across the country. And many of them are very small. Many have very, very limited resources. And I will say that probably in every state, there is a transgender organization that is needing support. And there's actually an organization called the Trans Justice Funding Project that you can find on the web that has been mapping the transgender organizations across the country. So pretty much any state you're in, if you go to that website, you will find a transgender group there that is desperately needing support, resources, volunteers, anything that folks can provide.
I would also say just, I think, conversation and really understanding the stigma. That's a big part of the sort of the hate speech that this administration, in particular Jeff Sessions, is wielding against our community. You know, I think that morality right now is being wielded against trans folks as a scare tactic to create more fear. And so we're seeing that as how that materializes to anti-trans bills and attacks in various states. And so I think one of the ways to inoculate against that is to really have conversations within your own circles, within your own folks, within your crew of people, the people that you are in relationship with. And I think that is really, you know, that ends up spreading out, because I think that is the way that we are really counteracting hate, right, is to really understand how do we demystify and bring clarity to a lot of this and shed the light. And there's so many story projects, there's so many ways that folks are sharing their stories, even online as well.
Awesome. So I'm from the South, and so I was super excited to see that you guys are partnering with Southerners on new ground. And so I'm just curious, you know, we see, I think, you know, the big cities and the coasts, right? There's like a certain level of support, maybe a certain level of space, and you guys are choosing to go into the South and work with organizations that are doing deep organizing there. So I'm curious if you could talk a little bit more about that, and so why you think there's an opportunity now, and the importance of that work.
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, Transgender Law Center, we actually started as a California-focused organization, and then maybe like 7 or 8 years ago became national. And so there was a point where we were clear that we wanted to prioritize and expand into another region of the country. And for us, our thinking was, where are the regions that have the least access to resources and are facing some of the greatest attacks? And we were also really clear that we wanted to make sure we were centering the leadership of trans and gender nonconforming people who were already in those regions, who were already in those states, and had been organizing to keep their communities safe and to fight for their rights for many, many decades. So when we decided to start to prioritize work in the South, we already had a partnership with a group called Southerners on New Ground. They're a regional Southern LGBT organization. They've been around for over 20 years, deep roots in the South. So we knew that we wanted to launch this work in partnership with a group like SONG. So that project's been going on for a couple of years, and for us it was really a way to be clear that as a national organization we have a really different vision for the ways in which national organizations can support local and regional work.
Awesome. Anybody in the audience have questions?
No one?
Is the TLC, is that comprised of mostly lawyers, or what makes up the organization?
Yeah, so we have a really strong legal team, and that is definitely a key piece of what we do. But our approach to the work is that, you know, we really see what are the issues, what are the needs that people are experiencing in communities across the country on the ground, and then what are the strategies that we need to move to address those needs. So that can include litigation, it can include legal information and services and support, it can include leadership development, policy advocacy, movement building, and public education. Like, we are really about like doing whatever it takes to support trans community.
I have a question.
Mhm.
Do you guys feel that the state of California is nicer to the transgender communities compared to some other states nearby?
That's a tricky question. I mean, I would say that from a policy perspective, there's a lot of stuff on the books that should protect folks, not just trans folks, but from a lot of discrimination. And I would say that, you know, we have through our helpline, we get so many calls from Californians, transgender Californians who are calling and still being faced with discrimination, are still faced with antagonism in the workplace, and are told, like, you cannot transition, or what are you're gonna scare the children, that kind of stuff. And so we're still getting a lot of calls from folks here in California. So that's why for us, like, to get to your question as well, it is not just about the legal strategy or the policy strategy, it is also about changing culture. And so for us, the ways in which we're trying to make these various interventions to build people power, to build the knowledge and the consciousness, to raise the consciousness of folks around gender and around the intersections of gender and race and class. All of that comes together, and I think even in states that there's a lot of protections, we're still seeing the ways in which, you know, like ballot measures were going to be introduced here in California that were anti-trans, you know, and so that is coming from a place of, you know, not just ignorance, but it's coming from a place of just not understanding or seeing, acknowledging the history of trans folks, not just in this country, but just in all civilizations, right? And so I think that to me is one piece that we're trying to address in every single state. And I would say California does have a really amazing infrastructure of amazing civil rights organizations and human rights groups that are raising the visibility and protecting and defending trans folks here in California. So,
Thank you.
Any other questions from the audience?
Do you have any services or support for young people in particular, teens probably mostly, counseling services or anything like that that teens can go to?
Yeah, so we don't provide counseling services. We do have a project called Truth, which is a partnership that we hold with GSA Network. GSA Network is a national queer and trans youth organization, movement building organization, that is really about supporting trans youth leaders all across the country who are telling their stories, who are fighting for their rights, who are advocating in their school boards. And so we have that project that is really about supporting trans youth leadership, and many of them are supporting so many other trans young people in their community who are experiencing the harassment and the violence. There are a lot of resources here in California that do provide counseling services for trans youth.
and through our legal helpline, we're also connected to, you know, we get calls, so we also refer out to folks, and we have all the, you know, organizations that are providing services. So yeah, the calls that we get are not just for legal help. There's like for help around just even feeling safe within oneself. Yeah.
Oh, were you?
Is there a particular law that you, or policy change that would make the most impact? Uh-oh, sorry.
No, that's a great question. I mean, I think that is a question that I think a lot of organizations are trying to seek, right? And I would say, in my experience of also just, I don't know, I do also a lot of detention and prison work, and to understand, even like in that context, right, there's been so many inroads, like PREA and the national based standards on, you know, standards on detention, and, you know, they're books of ways that are technically supposed to keep people safe in detention and prisons. And how, you know, when I do stakeholder visits and I visit detention facilities, none of that is happening, right? And so the experiences that are happening and the ways that policies and protections are supposed to protect vulnerable populations is, I think that there's a lot to understand there. And I would say that, at the end of the day, I think for trans folks, we are fighting for basic human rights and basic human dignity. We are, that is the place that we are at still, right? And so there is so much to do around that, both on a local level, on a state level, and a federal level. So there's that opportunity. I think and that's why we're doing the work in the legal system and in the courts. Yeah.
Thank you both so much for being with us. Thanks to our Facebook Live audience. We'll see you next time.
Hi, Mom.
Thank you.